Kentucky, autumn 1847. The morning Silas Cotter was told to leave, the maple trees along the creek had just begun to turn, their leaves catching fire in shades of orange and crimson that made the whole valley look like it was glowing from within. He would remember those colors for the rest of his life. How nature could be so beautiful while human hearts turned so cold. "You're not welcome here anymore," his older brother Nathaniel said, standing in the doorway of the farmhouse where 3 generations of Cotters had lived and died. "Father left this land to me, and I say who stays and who goes." Silas stood in the yard with nothing but the clothes on his back and a canvas bag containing his tools. He was 31 years old, unmarried, the younger son who had worked the farm alongside his brother for 15 years without complaint or compensation. When their father died the previous spring, everyone assumed the brothers would continue as before, sharing the labor and the modest profits that the rocky Kentucky soil provided. But Nathaniel had other plans. He had a wife now, Margaret, a woman from Louisville who found country life beneath her expectations and found Silas even more so. She wanted the farmhouse to herself, wanted her husband's attention undivided, wanted the awkward bachelor brother gone. "Where am I supposed to go?" Silas asked, not pleading, just asking. He had nowhere, no money, no prospects, no friends wealthy enough to take him in. The farm had been his entire world since childhood. "That's not my concern," Nathaniel replied. "You're a grown man. Figure it out." Margaret appeared behind her husband, her face arranged in an expression of false sympathy. "Perhaps you could find work in Lexington. They always need laborers there." Silas looked at his brother, searching for some trace of the boy he'd grown up with, the boy who had taught him to fish and hunt and read. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who couldn't meet his eyes. "You'd do this to your own blood?" Silas asked quietly. "After everything we've been through together?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just go." Silas picked up his bag and walked away without another word. Behind him, he heard the farmhouse door close with a finality that felt like a coffin lid slamming shut. He walked for 3 days, heading east into the hills where the farms grew smaller and the forests grew thicker. He had no destination in mind, just a vague instinct to get away from people who might know his family, who might look at him with pity or contempt. The land rose steadily as he climbed, the hardwood forests giving way to pine and hemlock, the temperature dropping as elevation increased. By the 3rd evening, he was higher than he'd ever been, looking down at a valley so distant that the farms looked like toys arranged by a child. That was when he found the cave. It wasn't much to look at from outside, just a dark opening in a limestone cliff, half hidden by rhododendron bushes that had grown wild across the rocky slope. Silas almost walked past it, but something made him stop. A feeling, perhaps, or just the practical recognition that he needed shelter, and this was shelter of a sort. He pushed through the bushes and stepped into darkness. The first thing he noticed was the temperature. Outside, the autumn evening was cold enough to see his breath. Inside the cave, the air was warm. Not just less cold, but genuinely warm, like stepping into a room with a fire burning. Silas stood still for a moment, confused, wondering if he was imagining things. He wasn't imagining anything. The deeper he walked into the cave, the warmer it got. Silas had worked in his father's root cellar every autumn for 20 years, storing vegetables for winter. He knew that underground spaces stayed cool in summer and warm in winter, something about the earth maintaining a constant temperature below the frost line. But this was different. This was warmer than any cellar he'd ever experienced. He explored carefully, using the last of the daylight filtering through the entrance. The cave was larger than he'd expected. A main chamber, perhaps 40 feet wide and 60 feet deep, with a ceiling high enough to stand without stooping. The floor was relatively flat, covered with fine sand that had accumulated over centuries of water flow. A small stream trickled along one wall, disappearing into a crack in the rock, and everywhere that remarkable warmth. Silas spent his first night in the cave sleeping on bare sand, wrapped in his coat, warmer than he'd been in any bed at the farmhouse. When he woke the next morning, he knew he'd found something extraordinary. He just didn't know yet what to do with it. The first week was about survival. Basic, immediate, desperate survival. Silas had his tools: a good knife, a hatchet, a small saw, and a coil of rope. He had the skills his father had taught him, skills that Nathaniel had apparently forgotten the value of when he'd cast his brother out. And he had the cave, which provided shelter from wind and rain and the increasingly cold nights that were creeping down from the mountains. He built a simple sleeping platform from fallen branches, raising himself off the sand floor where moisture might collect. He gathered nuts and late berries from the forest, supplementing them with rabbits and squirrels that he snared using techniques learned in boyhood. He found a spring uphill from the cave that provided clean water, better than the creek that ran through the farm back home. The work kept him from thinking too much about what he'd lost. At night, when the work was done and the darkness pressed in, that was harder. He lay on his rough bed listening to the silence, remembering the sound of his mother's voice singing hymns in the kitchen, his father's laugh, his brother's friendship before Margaret came and poisoned everything. Some nights he cried. He wasn't ashamed of it. A man who'd lost his family was entitled to grief, even if that family was still alive and had chosen to cut him loose. But during the days, he observed. He studied. He tried to understand the remarkable warmth that made his cave habitable when the forests outside were preparing for winter. The temperature inside the cave, he eventually determined, stayed constant at approximately 87 degrees. Warm enough to be comfortable without any fire, warm enough to sleep without blankets on all but the coldest nights. At first, he thought there must be a hot spring somewhere deeper in the cave system, feeding warmth into the rock. But the stream that trickled along the wall was cool, not warm, and he could find no evidence of thermal activity anywhere in the chamber. The answer, when he finally figured it out, was simpler and more elegant than any hot spring. The cave was breathing. It took Silas 3 weeks of careful observation to understand what was happening, and another month to figure out how to use it. The cave had 2 openings, the main entrance, where Silas had first entered, and a smaller vent near the ceiling at the back of the chamber, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. This vent connected to a network of passages that ran deep into the mountain. Passages that Silas never fully explored, but could hear when he pressed his ear to the rock, a faint whisper of moving air. During the day, when the sun warmed the mountain's surface, air flowed into the cave through the main entrance and out through the upper vent. This warm air heated the rock walls, which absorbed the heat like a massive stone stove. At night, when the surface cooled, the flow reversed. Cool air entered through the upper vent and pushed the warm air out through the main entrance. But because the rock walls had absorbed heat all day, they released it slowly through the night, maintaining the cave's temperature even as the world outside grew cold. The system was self-sustaining, eternal, powered by nothing but the sun and the natural properties of stone. It had been operating for thousands of years before Silas arrived, and would continue for thousands of years after he was gone. All he had to do was not interfere with it. The locals called these formations breathing caves, though most didn't understand why they breathed or how to benefit from the phenomenon. Silas had heard old-timers mention them in passing, usually in the context of superstition. Caves that moaned in winter, caves where ghosts lived, caves to be avoided by sensible folk. Silas wasn't superstitious. He was practical. And he saw an opportunity that no one else had recognized. If the cave could stay warm through autumn, it could stay warm through winter. If it could stay warm without firewood in October, it could stay warm without firewood in January. All he needed was shelter sturdy enough to survive the season, and knowledge of how to work with the cave's natural systems rather than against them. He began to plan. The shelter Silas built inside the cave was unlike anything the Kentucky hills had ever seen. Traditional cabin construction focused on keeping cold air out and warm air in, usually through thick walls and a good fireplace. But Silas didn't need to generate heat. The cave did that for him. What he needed was to manage the cave's airflow so that the warmth stayed where he wanted it, while still allowing the breathing cycle to continue. He started with the main entrance, the source of the daytime warm airflow. He built a wall across the opening using flat stones from the hillside, mortared together with clay from the stream bed. But he didn't seal the entrance completely. Instead, he created a series of adjustable vents, wooden shutters that could be opened or closed to control how much air entered the cave. The upper vent was trickier. He couldn't reach it easily, and blocking it completely would stop the cave's breathing cycle entirely. His solution was elegant. He built a tapering chimney from the main chamber up toward the vent, using more flat stones and clay. This chimney concentrated the outgoing airflow, making it more efficient, while leaving him control over the rate of exchange. Inside the chamber, he built actual living quarters, a sleeping alcove carved into a natural recess in the wall, positioned where the warmth collected most intensely. A simple kitchen area near the stream, with a flat stone surface for food preparation. A workspace where he could continue the woodworking that had always been his private pleasure, even when working the farm consumed most of his days. He built no fireplace. He would need no firewood. The work took him through October and into November, racing against the approaching winter. Some days his fingers were too cold to work until he retreated into the cave's warmth to recover. Some nights he lay awake calculating whether he had enough time, enough materials, enough skill to finish before the real cold arrived. He finished on November 23rd, the same day the first serious snow began to fall. Winter came to Kentucky like a beast that year, one of the coldest in living memory. Snow fell for 3 days straight, burying the mountains under a white blanket that muffled all sound and made travel impossible. Temperatures dropped to 15 below zero, cold enough to kill livestock in their barns and freeze unwary travelers where they stood. The old people said they'd never seen anything like it, and they were probably telling the truth. Inside his cave shelter, Silas Cotter slept in his shirt sleeves. The breathing system worked exactly as he'd calculated. During brief, sunny periods, warm air flowed in through his adjustable vents, absorbed by the stone walls that surrounded him. At night, and during storms, the walls released their stored heat slowly, maintaining a temperature that never dropped below 80 degrees, and sometimes climbed as high as 90. He had no firewood because he needed no firewood. While families across Kentucky huddled around hearths, burning through their winter stores and praying for an early spring, Silas worked on his wood carvings in comfortable warmth, went to sleep without shivering, woke without the bone-deep cold that usually accompanied winter mornings. The stream inside the cave never froze. He had fresh water when wells across the region were locked in ice. The rabbits and squirrels he'd preserved in autumn kept him fed, supplemented by stores of nuts and dried berries that he'd gathered during the fall abundance. He was, against all probability, comfortable. More than comfortable. He was content. The solitude that had seemed like punishment at first became a gift. No one to please, no one to accommodate, No one to tell him he was doing things wrong. He could eat when he was hungry and sleep when he was tired. He could spend whole days carving intricate patterns into walnut and cherry wood, creating beautiful things for no reason except that they were beautiful. He thought about his brother sometimes, wondering if Nathaniel ever felt guilty about casting him out. He thought about Margaret, her calculated cruelty dressed up as practical concern. He thought about his parents, both gone now, and whether they would be proud of what he'd built, or horrified by what their family had become. Mostly, though, he thought about the future. About spring, when he could expand his shelter, improve his systems, create something even more remarkable. About summer, when he could trade his carvings in town for supplies he couldn't produce himself. About years to come, when this cave might become not just a refuge, but a home. He had been rejected by his family. He had been cast out with nothing. And somehow, he had ended up in the warmest place in Kentucky, owing nothing to anyone, surviving through his own intelligence and labor. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it might be the life he was meant to live. The first visitor came in late January, when the snow had settled enough to make travel possible, if not comfortable. His name was Ezekiel Marsh, a trapper who worked the high country every winter and knew these mountains better than anyone alive. He'd seen smoke rising from the hollow where Silas's cave was located and had come to investigate, expecting to find a traveler's campfire or perhaps a hermit's shack. What he found instead was a man emerging from a hole in the rock face, dressed lightly despite the bitter cold, looking healthier and more comfortable than anyone had a right to look in the middle of the worst winter in decades. "You livin' in there?" Marsh asked, pointing at the cave entrance with its carefully constructed stone wall and wooden vents.
"I am," Silas replied. "Care to come in and warm up?"
Marsh followed him through the entrance, his skepticism turning to wonder as the cave's warmth enveloped him. He stood in the main chamber, turning slowly, trying to understand how a space could be this warm without a fire burning anywhere. "How?" he finally asked. "How are you doing this?" Silas explained the breathing system, the two openings, the airflow patterns, the rock walls that absorbed and released heat. Marsh listened with the intensity of a man who had spent his whole life in these mountains and thought he knew all their secrets.
"I heard about breathing caves,"
Marsh said when Silas finished. "Never thought to live in one. Never thought anyone could." Most couldn't. This one's special. The right size, the right shape, the right orientation to catch the sun. Took me a month to figure out how to work with it instead of against it. Marsh stayed for dinner, sharing news from the outside world that Silas had been cut off from for months. The winter was killing people and livestock across the region. Families were burning furniture to stay warm. Food supplies were running low, with spring still months away. "And here you are, warm as toast with no firewood," Marsh said, shaking his head. "You're either the smartest man in Kentucky or the luckiest." "Maybe both," Silas admitted, "though I'd trade some luck for a better family if I could." Marsh raised an eyebrow, and Silas found himself telling the whole story. His father's death, his brother's betrayal, Margaret's poison, his exile from the only home he'd ever known. The words came out easily, perhaps because Marsh was a stranger, perhaps because the winter solitude had built up pressure that needed release. When he finished, Marsh was quiet for a long moment. "Your brother sounds like a fool," he finally said. "A man who'd throw away family for a woman's whim doesn't deserve the family he's got." "Maybe so, but he's got it anyway, and I'm here." "Here's not so bad, from what I can see." Marsh gestured at the warm cave, the comfortable furnishings, the carved wooden figures that lined a natural shelf in the rock. "You've built something real, Silas. something most men couldn't build with 10 times the resources. That counts for something. Silas hadn't thought of it that way before, but hearing it from a stranger, he began to believe it might be true. Word spread, as word always does in small communities where news is scarce and winters are long. By February, Silas had received visits from 3 more travelers, each one drawn by stories of the cave that stayed warm without fire. They came skeptical and left convinced, carrying tales back to their towns and families that grew more elaborate with each retelling. The hermit in the mountain who had mastered the very rock itself, the cave that breathed like a living thing, the man who had been cast out by his family and had built a palace in the wilderness. Silas didn't encourage the attention, but he didn't discourage it either. The visitors brought useful goods, salt, flour, coffee, in exchange for his hospitality and the warmth that he had in abundance. They brought company, too, which he found he missed more than he'd expected after months of solitude. One February visitor was different from the others. Her name was Rebecca Holloway, a widow from the valley whose husband had died in a logging accident 3 years earlier. She had heard about the warm cave from Ezekiel Marsh and had made the difficult winter journey to see if the stories were true.
"My cabin's cold," she explained, sitting by the cave wall with a cup of hot tea that Silas had heated on a simple stone platform. "The chimney doesn't draw right, and I can't afford enough firewood to keep it warm properly. I've been sleeping in my coat for 2 months."
"I'm sorry to hear that," Silas said. "It's a hard winter."
"The hardest I can remember. But that's not why I came."
She looked at him directly, her brown eyes steady and unashamed.
"I came to see if you might teach me what you know. About the caves, about the breathing, about staying warm without burning half the forest."
"You want to live in a cave?"
"I want to survive. If that means a cave, then yes."
Silas studied her face, seeing the lines that cold and grief had carved there, the determination that had driven her up a mountain in the dead of winter on the strength of a trapper's story. She was perhaps 35, still young enough to start over, still strong enough to do the work that starting over required. "It's not easy," he said. "Finding the right cave, understanding how it breathes, building systems that work with it instead of against it. It took me months to figure out, and I made plenty of mistakes along the way."
"I'm not afraid of hard work, or mistakes."
"And it's lonely, especially at first. There's no one to talk to, no one to help when things go wrong." Rebecca smiled slightly, the first time her expression had softened since she arrived.
"I've been lonely for 3 years, Mr. Cotter. A cave's not going to make that worse."
Silas found himself smiling back. "Then I suppose I could teach you, if you're willing to learn."
"I'm willing."
She stayed for a week, learning everything Silas could teach her about breathing caves and thermal mass and airflow management. She was a quick study, asking intelligent questions and remembering the answers. By the time she left, she had a list of cave formations to investigate in her own valley and a set of principles that would guide her search.
"Thank you,"
she said on the morning of her departure, standing at the cave entrance with the cold February wind tugging at her coat.
"You've given me hope I didn't have before."
"Come back in spring," Silas said, surprising himself. "Tell me how it goes."
"I will."
He watched her walk down the mountain until she disappeared among the trees, then returned to his warm cave, feeling something he hadn't felt since his brother had cast him out. Not quite happiness, but something close to it. Spring came late that year, as springs do after hard winters. The snow retreated slowly, grudgingly, leaving behind a landscape scarred by its passage. Trees had fallen under the weight of ice, Streams had carved new channels through frozen soil. The farms in the valley had lost livestock, crops, and in some cases people, to the cold that had gripped the region for 5 terrible months. Silas emerged from his cave into a world transformed, blinking in the bright sunlight like a bear leaving its den. He had survived the winter without firewood, without suffering, without anything but the tools he'd brought and the knowledge he'd developed. He had done what no one else in Kentucky had done, and he had done it alone. Almost alone. Rebecca Holloway returned in April, her face weathered by her own winter, but alive with excitement. She had found a breathing cave in her valley, smaller than Silas's but suitable for her needs. She had begun construction on a shelter inside it, using the principles he had taught her.
"It works,"
she said, almost laughing with relief.
"I couldn't believe it at first, but it works. The cave stayed warm all through March, even when we got that late snow."
"Did you doubt it would?"
"I doubted everything. That's how I survive, by doubting and then proving."
She met his eyes with an openness that made something shift in his chest.
"You proved right, Silas. About the caves. About a lot of things."
She stayed for 3 days that first visit, helping him expand his shelter and sharing meals that turned into conversations, that turned into something neither of them had expected to find in the wake of their losses. They married in June, a small ceremony attended by Ezekiel Marsh and a handful of others who had become friends during the winter's visitors. Rebecca moved into the cave that had sheltered Silas through his darkest season, and together they began to build something larger than either could have built alone. The years that followed brought recognition that Silas had never sought and still didn't entirely want. Word of his breathing cave technique spread throughout Kentucky and into neighboring states. Farmers and miners and anyone else who struggled with harsh winters came to learn from the man who had mastered the earth's own warmth. Some paid in money, some in labor, some in goods that made the cave dwelling more comfortable with each passing season. Silas taught them all, patiently explaining principles that had taken him months to discover. He drew diagrams and built models, helped students find suitable caves, and designed shelter systems tailored to each location's unique characteristics. By 1855, there were 17 breathing cave dwellings in the region, all built using methods that traced back to his desperate first winter. The techniques he developed eventually reached academic attention. A professor from Transylvania University in Lexington made the journey in 1858, spending 2 weeks studying Silas's cave and documenting his methods. The resulting paper, published in a scientific journal that Silas never read, described principles of geothermal regulation and passive solar heating that wouldn't be fully understood for another century. Modern analysis of breathing cave systems confirms what Silas figured out through observation and experimentation. Caves with the right configuration can maintain temperatures between 85 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of external conditions. The thermal mass of surrounding rock, combined with solar-driven convection currents, creates a self-sustaining heating system that requires no fuel and produces no smoke. Silas Cotter didn't discover these principles. They had been known in various forms for thousands of years, used by ancient peoples across the world. But he rediscovered them through necessity, applying scientific thinking to a desperate situation and emerging with knowledge that benefited generations after him. Nathaniel Cotter died in the winter of 1863, during another brutal cold snap that killed his remaining livestock and left his farm bankrupt. Margaret had left him years earlier, returning to Louisville when it became clear that country life would never provide the luxuries she craved. Silas heard the news from a traveler passing through and felt nothing except a distant sadness for the brother he had once known. The Nathaniel who had taught him to fish and hunt and read
had died long before his body followed, killed by greed and weakness and the influence of a woman who saw family as obstacle rather than treasure. The farm passed to distant cousins who sold it to strangers. The Cotter name disappeared from the valley, where it had existed for 3 generations. But high in the mountains, in a cave that breathed with the rhythm of the earth itself, another Cotter line continued. Silas and Rebecca had 3 children, all born in the warm shelter that their father had built from nothing. 2 sons and a daughter, raised in a home that stayed comfortable through the worst winters Kentucky could deliver, educated by parents who valued knowledge and kindness over bloodlines and social position. The eldest son, William, became an engineer who designed heating systems for hospitals and schools across the South. The younger son, Thomas, took over the cave homestead and expanded it into a working farm that supplied the growing town in the valley below. The daughter, Sarah, married a teacher and raised 6 children of her own, all of whom knew the story of their grandfather's exile and triumph. Silas lived until 1889, dying peacefully at the age of 73 in the same cave where he had found refuge 42 years earlier.
Rebecca followed him 2 years later, buried beside her husband, on the mountainside they had made their home. Their gravestone, carved by a grandson who had inherited Silas's gift for woodworking, bears a simple inscription. They were cast out and found warmth. They were alone and found each other. They had nothing and built everything. The cave still exists today, though the shelter inside it has long since crumbled. Visitors who make the climb can still feel the remarkable warmth that Silas discovered on that autumn day in 1847, still experience the breathing that he turned from curiosity into survival. Most of them have never heard of Silas Cotter, but they stand in his home, warmed by the same principles he mastered. Proof that rejection by family doesn't have to mean rejection by life. Sometimes, the people who cast us out are doing us the greatest favor they'll ever do. They're setting us free to find our own warmth, our own way, our own place in a world that has room for everyone willing to learn its secrets. The breathing cave technique that Silas pioneered has influenced modern sustainable architecture in ways he could never have imagined. Earth-sheltered homes, passive solar design, thermal mass construction. All of these contemporary approaches echo principles that a desperate man figured out with nothing but observation and necessity as his teachers. Universities now study geothermal regulation as a solution to energy crises. Architects design buildings that work with nature rather than against it. Engineers calculate thermal mass and convection patterns using computers that Silas couldn't have conceived of. But the fundamental insight remains the same. The earth itself provides warmth to those who know how to accept it. Silas Cotter was thrown away by his family. He landed in a cave that kept him warm at 87 degrees through the worst winter in Kentucky history. He never thanked his brother for the exile. But sometimes, in the comfortable warmth of his remarkable home, he almost felt grateful. Almost.